Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit in 2022, September 2022, and we start with a bang on modeling failure modes, which is a really cool way of looking at threat modeling by one of the world threat modeling experts, Izar. So over to you, and let's expand on this really important topic. And let me know when you want me to flick the slides over.
Thank you. Okay, let's go for the first one. So, just a couple of words about myself. I am currently the principal security architect / engineer. I don't know what it is this week, and interim head of security at Squarespace. We do web hosting and web commerce and all that good stuff. I have been doing the security thing since the 90s. It's been a while since I've been looking at things from the security point of view. And right now, my focus is looking at modern SDLCs, basically agile and all that good stuff, and figuring ways to reduce the friction between security and developers. People who are more familiar with my practice, that's basically the centerpiece for me. I want to get out of this model of a lot of dependencies on the security team for a number of reasons that I'll be happy to discuss in a different format. But I want developers to take responsibility and to be equipped and to be ready to do their own security. I recently co-authored the Threat Modeling, a practical guide for development teams from O'Reilly with the amazing Matthew Coles. And I am one of the members of the Threat Modeling Manifesto working group. 15, for those who are not familiar, 15 threat modeling practitioners got together, people with a lot of experience. And we said, okay, how can we put some order into chaos and bring some basic principles and values and ideas for people on how to look at this thing called threat modeling, right? So the standard disclaimer, these views are mine. They are not my employers. They don't pay me enough to have my views. So with that said, I have to open a parenthesis here. Yesterday, I made a small timing mistake, and I took 2 shots, one for flu and one for COVID, the 5th booster. And that zonked me out of my head. I am basically right now, if you look at me, you see a line crossing my head is the amount of coffee that I have had to be able to speak to you today. So I will probably lose myself in some places. But on the other hand, I am trying something new on this presentation. Next slide, please. So for this one, I am trying less slides and more talk. And once we hit the talk part of the thing, I would be very, very glad if you people were able to open your microphones or put stuff in the chat. And I would be really, really interested in hearing your view about the things that I'm putting forward and your particular experiences. I think that many of you who had a chance to read the abstract for this presentation, when I say failure modes for threat modeling, I was basically saying, how is it that we can fail at threat modeling? We know what threat modeling is. We know how to do it. We know all the 1827, I don't know, it's a even day, there's probably more methodologies coming out all the time. So how is it that this thing fails? So next slide. So cool. Usually we talk about threat model and we say what it is, how you do it, what value you get out of it, and all that good stuff. But basically when a team is given the opportunity or find themselves in a place where now they have to start thinking about threat modeling, they are in one of 2 situations. Next one. It's either we need one, we don't have one, we need one, or yay, we did one. And from that, you get an outcome. And that outcome is, did we do good? You have to look at the last line, the last of the 4 questions by Adam Shostak, and ask yourself, how well did we do this thing that we call a threat model? Did we do good? If we did it well, if we found everything that we wanted, if we got all the value that we needed out of it, then yay, we go forward and we start again. As you all remember, as you all know by now, threat modeling is a very, very cycling activity. You finished one, things changed, go back and do it again. But what happens if we have not done good? Then, next one,
So
we failed. So let's go and have lunch. That's an option. Another option is, how can we fix this? So it's okay. Once you get to how can we fix this, then basically you are allowed to go back to the beginning, because you just created value that wasn't there before. You tried that threat modeling, didn't work, things did not go as well as planned or as expected. So you got to a conclusion. What can I change? What should I change in order to be able to say, you know what? I got some value from this activity. And this is what I want to talk to you about today.
So we had a good question from Abbas.
Oh,
Do you mind if we bring the questions in? Abbas, can you unmute, or do you want me to ask for you?
I can unmute myself. So
Cool.
Hi, everyone. It's very exciting to be back on the Open Security Summit. One quick question, which is, how do you say, you're saying like we need one, or we did one, did we do good? How do you check if you did a good, how do you check on the quality of your threat modeling? How do you identify the quality here? So what drives you to say this is a good threat model or not a good threat model?
So first one, thank you for a question. Second, and just another parenthesis here, I love opening parentheses. This is one of the great advantages of the Open Security Summit. You get people who come in and they don't think twice. They just throw you like on the deep end. They give you like the most difficult question that they can imagine. And you know what? There's no softballs, and you just jump into it. So the easy way out for your question is you could probably write another book on how do you quantify the quality of a threat model, right? It's just so many different variables. It's just the expectation is different. The things that you can get. Okay, let's put it like this. What you get out of it is what you put into it. So how good it's going to be, one way that you can already quantify is how much of an effort did you put into it. If you're not satisfied with the initial effort that you put in, chances are you're not going to be satisfied with the end. But I think that one of the most important things that came out of the threat modeling manifesto, and we're going to go back to that in a second, is that at the end of the process, sorry, not at the end, because we said it's cyclic, at that stage of the process where you look at your results, if you got to a point where you can tell yourself, I got value out of this, I now have something that I did not have before, then you got a good quality threat model. It may not answer questions that you thought that you had, but if you got value, it's answering something. Okay, it's giving you something that you didn't have before. Now, this sounds like a total cop-out, and I'll be the first one to say, yeah, it does. But my point is that you can come into a threat model and say, you know what, I haven't found any threats. Why haven't I found any threats? And now we're going already into the material for the next slides. Why haven't I found any threats? Because I don't know what threats to look for. I don't know how to look for a threat. I don't know what could be a threat. And surprise, you just got something from your threat model. Now you know that one of the big threats that you have is that you don't know what threats are. So somebody has to go through some training to be able to answer that question first and foremost. And then you go to the next loop, and all of a sudden, hey, you already know some threats. And now you start looking at your system, and because you didn't know that they were threats, if you didn't know anything about injection, about XSS before you started writing something, chances are that you got yourself exposed to it. So now all of a sudden you know about it. So in your threat model, now you can make provisions for identifying, for mitigating, for understanding the risk that you're carrying on those things that you've just learned about, right? So bring everything together. The way that I would quantify the quality of my threat model is if I got value of it, first of all. Second, later on in more advanced stages of the thing, when you know that people know what they're doing, when you know that people are asking the right questions and they are equipped to give you answers, that's when I start looking at coverage. Am I looking at the whole system? Am I looking at only a part of the system? I start looking at interfacing with other stuff. Am I looking at my system as if it lived in a bubble by itself, or am I looking at it in the context that it lives in, right? We're going to talk about this in the next slide as well. Am I looking for the right things? Am I focusing on the wrong threats, or perhaps am I assuming that my threat model lives at a different level than it actually should? So those are questions that are a bit more qualitative, that you can question your own threat model or the results of your threat model and see if what you got right now is something that corresponds to what you want it to be. Did I answer you, Abbas?
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, there are a lot of key, success factors that you can look at. But I mean, yeah, I think you covered them.
Yeah, but it's a really difficult question. Right?
I think it can be another session. I think this one can be another session just to share.
Easily, and you know that there are some people out there that I would really like to hear about that. People who have been at the OSS before, but that look at threat models from a value-added point of view, like Avi Douglan, or a Brooke who comes and looks at things in this holistic way. And yeah, we could definitely have a very interesting panel just about this one single question.
Yeah. If I can ask, right? I think as we evolve the practice, like you said, we're now in a nice scalable problem where we want a lot of people doing threat modeling. I do think that we need to start creating almost a maturity model for threat models, because there's definitely components that a good threat model will have, and I feel that one of the great ways to measure your did it add value, which I completely agree, right? I think that's a good measure, right? Are we getting value from this? Is where the multiple players get value from it. So the irony here is that security team, we are one of the ones that should also get value from a threat model done by somebody else, because it means that we scale a lot more if we are reviewing threat models. And especially if every time you review a threat model, like you said, you teach, you almost get a mode where we need to be less and less involved in the threat models, or we start to adjust. I've been on some weird situations where we sometimes from security become the voice of reason, which is really weird, because I've seen sometimes some devs they go so over the top on the threats because they really get into it that you almost have to go, it's all right, agreed, it's a pretty hard token to guess, right? And for example, right, on using GUIDs for some authentication or some module. But I feel that having a good description of what there's almost a multiple layers of the threat modeling and what does good look like, I think is very important.
Exactly.
Because somebody with less experience, and to be honest, like even somebody with a lot of experience, right? Like if you might have a lot of experience, but if you never looked at an AS400, or you've never looked at Google Cloud, or if you never looked at a particular application, right? If you can see some threat models of similar apps or similar structures, it's also a great way for you to learn very quickly and understand it. So those reference implementations, those examples of what does good look like, I think are very, very important.
To learn, yes, but, and this is my personal take, my personal experience, nothing, I don't offer it as words of wisdom, but many times on the Slack for OWASP, on the channel for threat modeling, you see somebody come in and introduce themselves and say, I have just been asked to create a threat model for my product. Where can I find an example of a threat model? And then this discussion starts where, are you looking for an example in order to know what the format of a good threat model report looks like? Or are you looking for an example to look for threats that might impact your system by looking at something similar to it? Mm-hmm. And I think that these are very different positions to be. And one of them is actually freeing, because it's taking you away from that bureaucratic mind that I have to think about how I'm going to report those things. And the other way is a bit more limiting, because it's saying somebody did this thing before and I'm going to go and do exactly the same thing that they did, and I can put a V on the checkbox and everything's fine. So if we move to the next slide, the first question that I want to address is, how do we fail to threat model? What are the things that would lead us to answer, no, I did not do a good job. So if we go line by line, it is too costly. You know what? It might be too costly. But the question is, how much is it going to cost to not have it? How easy is it to orient all the other processes that you have in your secure development lifecycle without having something that can act as a North Star to put you in the right direction of where you're going to go? Are you going to spend all your time and all your budget preventing this class of issues and ignoring this one because you never took that big look at the whole thing and say, okay, I have this, but I have these other ones too, and I have to take both into consideration when I do my analysis? Or is it too costly because, you know what, your people will have to stop writing lines of code to actually come up with a threat model? So you are going to get developer time, which is this amazing limited value that exists in the universe, almost like dark matter. You know that it's everywhere, but you know that it's very, very precious, and you shouldn't sort of touch it as much as you can. So what is it that makes it costly to you? That's a question to answer and say, is it really so costly that it can justify not having that threat model? The next one would be, is it too long? I think that the answer to, is it too long, has sort of vanished together with the admission by everybody that more or less, most of us are dealing with some form of agile process. More or less with different values of success. Each one of us is engaged with very short loops that have built-in iteration. And we are finishing one and already looking at the next one. So I think that today to say, oh, it takes me too long to threat model my system, it probably means that, I don't know, you're not doing the right scope. Perhaps you are not, you're not following one of the many methodologies out there that could help you limit the time investment and focus yourself into what's happening. So again, those are valid questions to ask and say, is there any way that I can better focus my effort and limit this time investment? The next one.
Just on this one, right? You know, because I just made a good point, you know, which says, remember that threat model success is more dependent on a developer's architect's knowledge of the system than is on a security team, right? Because if they don't know, right, you know, if they don't know how the thing works, right, you know, it becomes really, really hard. I think one of the actually elephants in the room that I feel we should tackle, and I do sometimes try to tackle this by putting value of threat modeling not just on the threat modeling itself, but on the fact that a lot of threat models, the first threat that they actually are almost, or the first risk that they are reducing, is the lack of technical documentation, is the lack of up-to-date technical diagrams. So in an interesting way, you know, a threat modeling should be super easy to do, because you just take the latest diagrams, the latest data flows, how the system works, you took the latest assessments, you map the risks, which, you know, should be kind of there, and then you just find some gaps, right? Like, or, exactly. You know, but I think the reason why you're right, is expensive and it takes long, is because we are almost having to tackle another problem or another risk, which is lack of technical documentation. That somehow the agile crowd fall into the trap of believing that is actually an added value.
Exactly. Yeah, I couldn't put it better myself. You hit it spot on.
And I do think that, you know, in the medium term, part of this is to start to have policies, right? To say, you know, like, you know, I'm one of the kind of, maybe passive aggressive, but one of the things I try to ask is, if you go to a team and saying, do you have a threat model? And if they say no, then you need to give them a risk to say, you don't understand the security implications of what you're building.
I want to sort of disagree with you here and bring back to what you started. I recently started dropping policies. I don't do policies anymore, because I noticed that policies, our policies, security development policies, they don't have teeth.
Yeah.
So if I
But
tell to someone you do a
yeah.
threat model or else what? You're gonna fire me because I don't do a threat model? No, I'm not.
Yeah,
what
but
I
I'm
can
I'm
do-
doing my policy a little bit different.
But
We-
wait, Dennis,
yeah,
wait.
go on.
What I can do is go back to what you said in the beginning to the maturity model and say, hey, you know what? If your team doesn't threat model yourself, you are here in maturity. If you do have a threat model of your whole system, you are here. Do you want to be here or here? And do you want to be better than the guy on the next desk? And
Yeah,
that
but
actually gives me some leverage.
Yes, well, but there's places where you do need a policy, right? I agree if you're not in a place where policies can scale, and if your policies are documents that nobody reads or have no teeth, then
But
yes.
those places usually do have teeth.
Yeah,
Like the
because
policy is mandated from the top and saying this is how we do things here, and if you don't do it like this, then we're going to have a problem.
well, think about it. Like you can have a policy that says for web exposed applications that have a certain type of attacker, you have to be maturity level 2.5,
Yep.
right? And that's it. But for internal systems, you can have 2. And for a startup mentality, or for innovative, or for new developments who are not touching customer data, you could have maturity 1,
True.
right? And that's a nice way to balance out, right? Actually, can we bring Nicolo? Let me just share him here. You also have a good point here. Just give me a second. Nicola, you should be able to share your mic if you can.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for
Hey.
that, Dennis. Hey, hi all. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. So we face a number of challenges when we try to threat model. Really, you can't threat model unless you've got information in front of you. Certainly solution diagrams have been a problem. Either they're too high level or they're just not there. So it has presented a challenge for us. And I think it's really important to kind of add that maturity piece because it helps not just threat modeling, but just going back to vulnerability management and many other sort of facets of InfoSec management.
That's so true. That's so true. And I think that it brings me back to something that we have addressed in previous sessions. And we look at threat modeling, and usually we focus on the threat part. We forget the modeling part. There is a very clear process here in building a threat model of, as you say, you can't protect what you can't see, of figuring out what is it that I'm trying to protect, right? And that's when you get something like what I came to call the Eureka Moment, where you have this conference room, all the developers in there, Mr. Senior Architect walks out to the whiteboard and starts drawing squares and arrows and says, well, and this is how this thing works. And then you see a raised hand at the back of the room, and it's the most junior developer saying, you know what, that is how it was designed to, but because of constraints of the framework, we had to do it in a different way.
Yeah.
And that's when the whole team goes, what? Yeah. And bang, you just got value from the modeling part of threat modeling. You didn't even get to the threat part.
Usually they start by saying, we had a problem. Which is exactly, we couldn't make it work like that. So we had to, and then the guy draws a line there. That's actually how it works.
Right. Hey, you know what? Let's open the whole list, just in case we don't get to the whole thing. So too difficult and too conceptual. Oh, too difficult and too conceptual. You get to this thing that you need to know what you're doing in order to threat model. And I think that by now, you folks may have figured out that I come from a point where I say, you know what, sometimes it's good not to know what you're doing so that you can learn as you do. And even if you don't learn the whole thing, or even if you make mistakes, there is value in that. So to stay back and say, I'm not going to do it because it's too difficult, or I'm not going to do it because it's too conceptual, that's a big mistake. You're closing yourself to something that down the road can have huge return of investment. Why? Because you don't want to take that difficult first step there. The next two, and they are sort of like complementary sometimes they go against each other. I didn't say much with that, but management and engineering fail to see the value. Each one of them for a different reason. Management usually looks at it and says, why should I give you this time when I would much prefer my engineers to be writing code, right? I need the product out of the door. I don't need a book about the product and how it works and how it can fail. And that's usually that vision of it's not going to happen to me. It will happen to everybody else. It's not going to happen to me. Everybody else is broken. My system is perfect. My engineers are perfect, and it's going to be fine. And if something happens, then I'm going to deal with it down the road. And that's where the value proposition begins. What would you much prefer to, and I'm sorry, it's a horrible, horrible example, but just to stress the value of the thing. If you go into a hotel room and you close the door and you look behind the door, there's a map of the floor where you are with a red line pointing you to the nearest fire exit, right? Would you prefer to be in an emergency situation in a hotel that offers you that map behind the door, or one that doesn't? It might, I hope, that it never comes to pass that there is a fire, but sometimes it does. And in that case, it's awesome that somebody took the time and the investment to actually draw a red line behind every door and say, this is the way that you go to get out of here really, really quick. So if management is expecting for the fire to start asking people, where's the nearest exit, then you know what? Let's talk about that a bit more, right? Same thing with engineering. Engineering would say, hey, you know, the code documents itself. And we have all these tools that scan the code and that scan the product and that give us a lot of value. And we don't need the threat model, because if we do something wrong, then we have these safeguards that are going to catch stuff out there. And to that I say, you know what? It's true. It's true. The tools are getting better every day. It's awesome what they can do nowadays compared to what they could do just a couple of years ago. But the conceptual part, the business process part, am I open to something like social engineering? There aren't tools nowadays that will catch that, or if there are, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with them, but I'm betting that there aren't. And to take engineers and to tell them, I have this process that can help you think at a higher level about your system, and see if perhaps, you know what, you're asking somebody for their email. Perhaps, I don't know, you should send them the email, you know, confirm that it's actually there so that I can't register with somebody else's email for whatever reason, right? And sometimes they go and they look at you and say, but why would somebody do that, right? What would lead someone to do that? And turns out that, hey, you know what, think about a threat model. And yeah, it might happen, right? You may come up with an attack persona who does have some interest in doing that very strange thing in your business process that you didn't think about, but the threat model took you there. We already scanned, and why do we need threat model? I already basically answered that one. And the last one, the include reason.h. If they don't want to do it, there will always be a reason. And this is where I think that the security practitioner has their biggest challenge, because now it's not their problem anymore. Now it's ours. Now we have to look at the way that we communicate security, that we communicate risk, that we communicate value, and we have to include ourselves into the process and say, hey, you know what? You don't see why this thing is good for you. You don't see any use for this. Here it is. This thing wouldn't have happened if we had a threat model, or this process is going to be much easier when we have a threat model. But the reason why I phrase it as include a reason is because they will bring something, and you will have to include that something into your process, and you have to use them. And in a very, in an analogy that gets overused, you will have to play some judo and use that energy against themselves. You have to turn that reason onto its head and tell them, hey, you know what, exactly because of that, we should be threat modeling, and we should be threat modeling all the time. I think that there was a question here by Abbas. One very important aspect security teams miss on is to scope their TM. One TM is never enough. You need multiple TMs. You can have a generic TM that you go down and you TM your components and make them accountable, and they'll come to you. And this hard. So first of all, thank you very much for the insight. And again, you are totally right. And it goes to scope and it goes to altitude. And we're going to touch on that a bit on the next slide. But divide and conquer is a technique that works. If you have one team that wants to threat model and one that doesn't, usually it helps if you show the finished product from the other one and you share their experience and you share the good and bad on their experience and you see if you can translate that to the other team. So yeah, divide and conquer or create scopes and create things at different levels and bring everything under one umbrella, definitely a valid technique. What time is it? 39. Okay, we have some time, but I want to have time for us to talk. So once you did threat model, how does the threat model itself that has been done, how does that thing fail? What are the things that lead us to say, didn't get the value that I wanted? Let's run the whole thing, Linus. And here I really base myself into the threat modeling manifesto. And I bring from there the ways that things can fail. I'm using the anti-patterns that got identified there. That's the stuff that's in double quotes. So first of all, if for any reason, the threat model itself does not bring value, then it failed. What could lead it to not bring value? First of all, there was no change in the security posture. So it could be a very subtle thing and a very self-explanatory thing. Before I didn't have a threat model, and now I have a threat model, I would say that that's already an increase in your security posture, right? But if before I didn't have a threat model, and now not only I don't have a threat model, but I have the experience of thinking that I have failed, then my security posture probably didn't change or even may feel like it went down. Not true, but it may give the feel. Another way to not bring value is to adopt the anti-pattern called the hero threat modeler, which is, you know what, let's call Joe. Joe's a smart guy, and he is going to be the responsible one to do the threat model for the whole thing. And in this way, we just, by definition, have limited whatever threat model comes out of it to the view of Joe. Now, Joe may be a very, very, very smart person, but I am ready to bet, much like the Eureka Moment example, that Joe does not know everything that there is to know about the system, especially with the systems that are increasingly more complex that we have nowadays. Gone are the days that you have one box, one daemon, one client, one database, and that's your system. We all know here that if you're not looking at the system, it's probably growing by itself. So to have one person be voluntold that they are going to be responsible for the threat model, the hero threat modeler, it's an anti-pattern, and it usually leads to either very small value or whatever value it brings, it reduces on the fact that now you are depending on one point of failure. So yeah, we have a threat model, but if Joe decides to go away from the company tomorrow, then nobody's going to understand or maintain the threat model. So did we actually get value by having Joe do the threat model? Probably not. The third factor is the admiration for the problem. It's when we spend so much time looking at the fact that we have to create a threat model and our reticence about beginning that thing and going somewhere with the thing, that we end up not doing it. Right? We fixate on, oh my God, it's so difficult. How can I ever do this well? And we don't even get to the point where we do it, but we don't do well so that we can learn from it and make it better. Right? So just sitting back and looking at the problem of threat modeling usually will not bring value. Another big way of failing for a threat model is if they do not express threats. Now, the at all thing here, okay? I have to be very, very careful with the way that I say this or that I express this. Even a threat model that at the end of the day says, we don't have any threats, it's all good. It is a threat model, right? A set with a size of 0 is still a set. But rare are the times that I have seen in my experience when that happens. And if you came up without any findings, chances are that you did not look well enough or in the right places. But if you did look well, if you think that you have good knowledge of your system, if you think that your people know what they need to know in order to identify threats, and you still came out with nothing, you probably got a failure there somewhere that you have to really look at, dig, and understand what is it that's happening. And the amount of possibilities in there is so huge that I don't want to even touch into it. So I'm just going to skim the surface by saying, if you came out without anything, look at the way that it's being done, because chances are that that was a failed threat model experience. Another way that they do not express threats is they don't express the right threats. They might have, and what do I mean by the right threats? Of course, there isn't something said, these are the right threats for the system. The system has threats, but there could be a tendency to overfocus, which is another anti-pattern that comes from the threat modeling manifesto, where we look at something perhaps that we know a lot about. So if you are a web company, you know a lot about XSS, so you look for XSS everywhere. That's it. I have found all the places that I could have a problem. I mitigated all of them. My threat model is good. Or you could be enamored by the idea of threat intelligence, and you are constantly looking for the next flashy, shiny new thing, and you ignore the ecosystem in which that thing lives, and if it actually applies to your system, or if the actors are actually actors that you worry about in your threat model. And you tend to always look at that shiny thing, and you forget all the basics, you forget all the 101s, all the good stuff that can happen that we tend to call the low-hanging fruit, but that are basically the basics, right? They are the things that we got so used to looking at that we tend to sometimes lower their level of value, but which I think is a mistake. You still can do a lot of those with those vectors and with those vulnerabilities. So that tendency to overfocus onto something specific at the cost of everything else is also a way that a threat model could fail. The next one is your threat model. The model part of your threat model does not represent the whole thing. Doesn't represent the system. Right, Abbas, maybe an utopia. So again, the threat modeling manifesto talks about perfect representation, right? There is no perfect representation. There's no perfect way to represent a given system. A given system could be represented in a number of different ways, and each one of those ways are going to help you surface different aspects of the system that are going to give you more information and are going to give you more angles to look at where you can identify possible threats, right? But there isn't rare, I think, is the person who's going to wake up and say, I need to do a DFD because a DFD is the only way that I'm going to identify any threats in the system. No, it's one of the ways. There are sequence diagrams. There are fishbone diagrams. There's a number of Wardley maps. I'm not very familiar with those, but I hope the context is right. But basically, that there isn't one way that's written in the wall. This is how thou shall represent your system. That's going to give you all the information and going to help you, take you by the hand and lead you to a threat model, right? So on the other hand, to use any of the different ways to represent the system, but fail to take the totality of the system into account, which is what Abbas mentioned in a couple of minutes ago. If you are scoping things and by mistake or by design, you ignore part of it, you may be missing important stuff. You may be missing things that are generated on one part of your system that you are not modeling, that do have an impact, a security value, a security impact on what you are modeling, but you are not taking those things into consideration because you're not seeing where they're coming from, where they're originating, right? So it's both the constantly looking for a perfect way to represent my model and not using the right scope to actually put the things in the model that need to be part of it. Another very, very popular way that threat models fail is when they die. A threat model is a living document. The same way that your system, and this goes even to systems that enter into maintenance mode. And the reason is very simple. The system may not be developed, but the threat map, the threats that are available, those are constantly improving, changing, new things coming in. So it could be that a system that has been perfect for 20 years, all of a sudden somebody figured out something else that, you know what, bites that thing. So even you have a system in maintenance mode, for completeness, for peace of mind, for compliance, for whatever reason, do add that to your scope of things that you are going to threat model. But back to the dead threat model, sometimes a team gets a pointy-haired requirement. Hey, we need to have a threat model. So everybody huddles up, threat model comes out, beautiful threat model, something unbelievable. And the next step, it gets signed off on, goes into the top drawer, forgotten. Nobody talks about that thing anymore. Nobody touches that thing anymore. Nobody refreshes it. Nobody looks at it as, again, as we spoke two slides ago, as a valuable source of information about that system, about what that system is, about what it does and how it does. And the thing just goes and dies. So there's no alignment to the culture and to the practices of the organization. The threat model just becomes this bubble in time and space that exists and pops and disappears and is not incorporated in, for example, training. You are bringing a new developer in your team. I'm sorry, but a threat model is such a great way to make somebody familiar with that system, right? A good threat model is going to show the intricacies of what speaks to what and which order and what's the payload when they're exchanging messages and how do you synchronize things and how do you store things, where are the keys, where are the crown jewels and all that stuff. So incorporating that threat model into your culture and practices and not letting it die a quiet death is extremely important. And that last line there, it's funny because there was a small discussion a couple of weeks ago on Twitter about exactly this sentence, your threat model is not my threat model. And there is so much behind that sentence. And the angle that I want to approach is that the same thing can be threat modeled at different altitudes with different amounts of detail and focus. And the output is going to be presented in a different way so as to serve a different public. So just to illustrate, the board of directors of your company, are they interested in a threat model? Definitely yes. But are they interested in the same representation of a threat model that your QA people are interested in so that they can test the mitigations and make sure that everything's in place? Most probably not. One of them is very interested in a representation of risk. The developers, they want a representation of risk that lets them prioritize things. The board just wants a green, yellow, red to let them sleep at night, knowing that against these threat actors, these threats have been evaluated. Here are the gaps. Here's the risk that we are carrying, right? So when I say your threat model is not my threat model, I'm not talking about, oh, I am such a smooth operator and I travel with 3 cell phones and I just use one of them on even days on airports that begin with L and so on and so forth. No, what I'm talking about is my threat model is different from your threat model because we are looking for different things. We want to be informed about different things. Okay? I spoke a lot. I did not quite mean to. Any questions on these failure modes of mine? Any experiences that anybody would like to share?
I just want to, hi, Abbas again here. So I just want to say that you mentioned something very, very important, that a threat model, it's a living document. How many times did you said like, let's go do a new threat model because there's a new feature, big update to your system, and suddenly you let the architects to go and redo that data flow diagram, the architectural diagram. So it is a living document, and it can be the core of everything, to be honest. Thank you. Great presentation, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, Maris here. Interesting points on the failures, and they resonate, I'm sure, for everyone in the audience. I think the key part is the library you mentioned of threat models and how that really helps, prevent duplication and reinventing the wheel every time that same system comes up. I think that's really useful.
Yep, true.
In terms of risk assessments, for me, I think that the threat model really helps us deliver a view of the controls and whether we've really addressed each and every step. So yeah, I think that's do not lead to security posture improvements, really useful. Got to agree with that.
Cool, very cool. Does anybody have any good story of how their or somebody adjacent threat model failed? Something perhaps that I forgot, something that's missing from here?
I just want to reiterate the point of not having enough information. I think that's when it probably goes wrong, because really in terms of that connectivity, that trusted domains, etc., and where that all happens and what systems reach out to what. If you don't have that information, it's going to fail. I think that's almost the foundation part. I'm sure most people would agree, and that probably goes back to the point Denise made earlier.
So let me ask you this, because it is an activity that could end up unbounded. How do you know that you have enough information?
Yeah, that's a really good point. You just don't know what you don't know, really. So you're reliant on that engagement and being part of that journey in terms of that design and understanding your own network yourself and being embedded into that. Because even though I rely on my infrastructure team, I'm also gathering that information every time we talk and how those systems and the proxies work and how that's in my head. So I can challenge in a way and actually say, how is that? Shouldn't that be reaching out to this system? Shouldn't we be talking about that? So when there are things missing, it almost feels that you want to participate and be part of that. And that's also a success factor for me. Hope that resonates with all in the audience.
And you touch on something that's so important, It could be that most times it is, that the same system actually is not owned by one single team. And I'm not talking about like different teams owning different parts of the system, but the system itself, like the example that you use, infrastructure. It could be that my developers don't know anything about the infrastructure where this system runs. They know that they have servers, and they know that they have databases, and they know that they have networking, but those things are like magic things in the sky that they receive from some God network team that gives them those resources and says, here's your credential, now go and do and write your stuff.
Oh, well said. Yeah, said. And I suppose I'm taking it outside of the development world, and I'm taking it into the kind of new solution, new system world where we're probably putting in a broader solution. So yeah, taking a little bit out of context out of the development world. And you're right, to some people it's a little bit of a black hole, isn't it? You're right. But sometimes you can put it into context and really maybe that engagement helps with those developers, right? And bringing it into light about how this is the bigger picture. So yeah, well said. That's a really good point.
And this brings me back to where I started when I turned the question on you. How do you know that you actually have enough information? And the yardstick that I use to get to that point is, first of all, I assume that I never have enough information, but that's me. That's a personal failure of mine. But in order to say, okay, we have just enough information that we can move to a better place, I usually ask the teams, hey, when you look at this description, when you look at this diagram, do you recognize your system? Because if they don't, something is going to gnaw at them. Somebody knows of a different bubble that's missing. Somebody knows of an arrow that should be there but isn't. or somebody knows of an error that is there, and you know what, in the current version doesn't exist anymore. So when I get the people who are participating in the process of creating that model to look at the model and say, I recognize my system. This is the thing that I wake up every morning to build on. That's when I know that I have enough information that I can move on.
So can I just add a couple of the comments? I think one of the things you said is that it's so critical, is this idea that threat models can have a huge amount of value to the business and the teams by being that documentation, being that place of record. What I would say in terms of the accuracy and even how depth it has or how effective it is, I would say without a threat model, you're not even playing. The beauty of a threat model is that I can look at the threat model and I can be very worried that that team has no idea of what they're dealing with, or I can look at the threat model and going, you know what, these guys are on the right track.
Yes.
And as long as the whole thing's not on fire, they most likely are going to get there because they're already thinking the right way. And the reality is that once you see a certain number of threats, it's almost like where's Wally, right? You cannot unsee them. And the developer teams and even management, they will fix it as long as you can present it in a good way. So I think the beauty of a threat model is that allows, in a way, the individual with more knowledge about the system or security or how it works, etc., to scale, because they don't have to do almost the first 3 bits. They can just come along, plug the little gaps, and really, in a way, leverage that, especially if you can have in a way that you can show it for others, which is why I'm less worried about the person that copies the threat models and then adjusts a little bit and think they're good, because the good news is you're now playing.
You now
right?
have one. Yes.
You're now playing, you have one, right?
Yes.
And the cool thing is to make people accountable sometimes by saying, is this correct? Because if you force that question, people pay attention, right?
You're forcing criticality, yeah.
Exactly, right? And I think there's a really sweet spot there that we haven't fully explored, which is the whole thing of, what is the real value that threat model can provide. And if you have enough wins, and you should be using that as reasons, that's why I feel the policy comes into play, because then you can kind of connect the dots by saying, we need this minimal amount of threat modeling across the board. But that's a mature environment for that.
Let me see if I can offer you something that perhaps will help with that. When I'm doing the work of marketing threat modeling, when I'm explaining why do we need threat modeling the first time, yeah. I like to compare a threat model with, that tube that you have in your clothes cabinet that you put all the suits on top. That tube for me is the threat model, because now I can get the hanger that has testing, hang on it. I can get the one that has training and hang on it. And from the output of the threat model, I can explain to a QA person, hey, here are some things that you should be looking for, that you should be testing for, and see if I forgot the mitigations. Or if my team is saying we can't find threats because we don't know enough about security on web, hey, here's a spot on training that I have to supply to my team. So I can get all the other activities of the SSDLC and hang them from the threat model and give them structure.
That's a cool analogy.
By using that freaking threat model.
Yeah, cool. Izar, you can continue. I do need to jump to the other session. I'm gonna make you wanna keep more, or I'll make you the host and you can continue. But I need to jump to the other one. So awesome. I'm gonna make you the host, and then when you finish, you can just stop the recording.
Sure. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Good stuff. Back.
Bye.
See you later.
Anything else that I can address for you folks? Anything that somebody wants to share or ask anything, just go for it.
I'm just wondering for the team, which frameworks work best? Has anyone got any preferences around frameworks, and do you just invent your own? Yeah.
Stride is the simplest and
spoofing, tampering,
straight to the point, easy on everyone.
Hey.
Well, I don't know. I made my own Stride.
No. Let me put it.
That's cool.
Wait. Let me put it like this. There's a lot of different methodologies out there. My point of view, and I want you to take into consideration that I am somebody who developed his own methodology and works hard to push it forward. My point of view is there is no ultimate better methodology. You will find methodologies that will help you in most cases, and they are going to be different. And you are going to find things in each methodology that are going to work for you and things that are not going to work for you, and that you are going to change so that you can adapt the process of threat modeling, again, to your culture and to your organization, right?
Interesting.
There are some methodologies that are extremely heavy, in double quotes, if you look at them from the agile point of view. But if you look from an acquisitions point of view, or from a maintenance point of view, or from a military point of view, or a waterfall point of view, they make absolute sense, and they are beautiful things.
They become overhead.
Yes, sorry, what we would call overhead. But in that context, that overhead makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Stride, for example, is one that I feel very comfortable using, because I know the threats, because I know what actions can lead to each one of those different impacts, right? To the STREID. But I know the teams that are new to the thing, they will look at me and say, spoofing, I don't know how to spoof. So how do I know if something is open to spoofing, right? So the problem space shifts from not knowing how to threat model to not knowing what threats are. And shameless plug here. That's why I created the continuous threat modeling methodology that basically takes you from a baseline of opening questions that can lead you to discuss things that eventually get to a security point of view, and then a different checklist that takes the developer by the hand and says, hey, you know what? If you just added a new process to the system, here are some things that I want you to take a look at and consider if they should be part of the threat model or not. So it's a bit more of a very quick, very iterative thing that goes with threat modeling every story, that lets people build their security arsenal as it goes. So I'm not asking someone, give me a list of all the possible things that could lead to an elevation of privilege. But I am telling them, hey, if you are just creating a new process, does it really have to run as root? Like, could perhaps, I don't know, you create a new user that has less privileges and you use that? Or can you isolate that some other way? So every methodology will take you to different places and through different ways, and all of them have value, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, look at it like, I mean, so sometimes you are hiring and you have someone like, what have you done? It's like, yeah, I've created a lot of playbooks, okay, and processes and stuff. Like, okay, I like playbooks, I like processes, but you know, for the playbook, for me as an example, and the same thing for a threat model. If you are following a threat model like you know, something like Stride or some, it scares me in a way that, you know, I create these stuff for, let's say, first line support, because they are just trying, as an example, to investigate an incident. They need to make sure they haven't missed on some checklist. But for you in security, it's all, you know, you can never like follow a model. It's really hard. It's really hard. You know, you need to go and investigate and dig here and dig there. How many times did you have the architect changing his data flow diagram or architecture diagram after you were, you know, were on a threat model with them? So that's why it's an innovative thing. So it's gonna change all the time. So you can't follow an exact thing. But I mean, it's good to have a guideline, the policy as a guideline, not as a plan, right? So as a guideline. So this is what you need to do. But I mean, it's up to you.
A guideline, not a guardrail. You shouldn't be limited by that policy, right?
Yes, exactly. So
you're totally right. I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah, I love the fact that you can have some flexibility in what you do, because I don't think there's a one size that fits all, but as long as you get to the end goal, and I think that's really important, isn't it? Really? So yeah, well said.
You know, I think that another thing that adds to the need for flexibility is that the people who are attacking us are extremely smart, and sometimes they have a lot of resources, and we keep changing this map under the feet of our systems and just hoping that everything stays the same, but it doesn't. So you, as a threat modeler, you have to constantly be educating yourself. Hey, Abbas, thank you so much. Thank you for the questions. All right, I think that I have to go to my next meeting. Apparently, I do have a job that I have to attend to. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. And I hope you enjoy the other sessions.
Thanks all.